Welcome to the Cornbread and Kool-Aid podcast for fans of Detroit Lions, fans of pro football, fans of mine, friends and family, and just general people who like podcasts. So my name is Demetrius. We've been on a little bit of an extended hiatus, but we're back. I guess the way to start these, I'm told, is if you like it, if you enjoy it at all, subscribe and like and do whatever it is you do that expresses the fact that you enjoyed the podcast. I would appreciate it. We start every podcast off the exact same way. We acknowledge the godfather of the podcast, the super producer extraordinaire, Mr. Mike Ward. We are coming back to you during the off season, and normally I will drop something around the draft. Chose not to do that this year. Life was lifing, as they say. But so we're gonna kick off season 8. Yeah, season 8. 3 years as the Roar podcast, which you don't need to go back and look those up. They weren't that great. And this is year 5 of the Cornbread and Kool-Aid podcast. So we will be drinking more during the podcast, protecting the voice. We're kicking off season 8 with a series because there's no games yet. So we got 2 months before we get any games. So we thought we'd kick it off by recording and sometimes going live, dropping a series of short pods. At least that was the thought. Like, I'm not really capable of doing short pods. So the idea, which came from my son, so thank you, Trevor, for the idea, was to sort of get back into the groove a little early, start picking some topics and dropping these little short pods to see what you guys think, get some interest, right? And so there's 2 parts to this. One, I'm looking for ideas, right? The idea is drop these topic-driven shorts. One topic, just do 20, 30 minutes, which for me will probably be 40 or 50 minutes, because if you know me, you know that, right? But some of the ideas that just kind of popped up was, what if we did, hey, let's talk about the worst trade in team history, or let's talk about the worst free agent signing in team history. They don't all have to be negative. It could be the best draft class, totality of the draft. Let's go back, look at a draft, see how that draft stacks up historically against other drafts. Let's do the best player in history. Well, second best player in history, because I think it's probably universal who number 1 is, right? But we could do something around who would be the second best player in team history. I think that's a decent conversation, right? You got people who are going to probably immediately jump to Calvin, and I can't really be mad at them for that, because that's a legitimate go-to sort of concept. But then there's people of a certain age that might talk about Bobby Lane. You got to go back and talk about Bobby Lane. There are people who could make a case for. My friend Richard Lane would call me and go, hey, what about my dad, Night Train Lane? No relation to Bobby Lane, but those are good ideas, good topics. We could do most impactful moment. What's the most impactful moment in the history of the organization, right? There are those who can make a case that it is the hiring of Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, maybe. There are others. So we're just going to drop 6 or 7 of these. Some of them will be live. Some of them I'll record them ahead of time and just drop them maybe on a Wednesday to get us through the next 8 weeks or so before we get actual football, which is what we all want and need and can't wait for anyway. But we'll get there. So we'll drop some of those, and I'm looking for ideas. So whether you watch this later and you want to go into the chat, or if you're on one of the lives and you want to drop in something, I'm fine with that too. But today we're going to do the worst all-time draft pick, a singular pick. And again, there will be people who will quickly rattle off their thoughts, right? A go-to. And that makes sense. I'm being sensitive to age, so I'm not going back that far, right? I'm going to try and stay 90s and onward, right? I considered a mid-80s choice, but I decided I want to kind of more stay relevant to somebody who might be listening, and all of us don't remember Reggie Rogers, but you could Google it, and that's actually kind of tragic, so I'm not making fun of that. But as the topic is today, a singular pick, a singular draft choice, what is the worst all time? And so when I thought about this, I thought about it in a lot of ways, right? And I thought it could be easy just to say, "Oh, that guy sucked," right? That's a go-to. But I decided to break it up into 5 categories, right? For the record, a lot of these guys that I'm talking about, they'll fit into multiple categories. Some guys will fit into more than one category, right? It's not just a one thing. So my 5 categories that I'm trying to put this into are like, where were they drafted? There's not going to be any 5th or 6th round choices here because by definition, they're 5th and 6th round choices. It's a risk reward thing. You take injured players in the 5th and 6th round, hoping they get healthy and they'll pan out. You take long shot players. That's what you do. That's what those rounds are for. So those aren't going to fit in this list. They simply didn't get drafted high enough. This one is around expectation. Like the higher you're drafted, obviously the more expectation there is of you. So that one, where they drafted, this is not in order. This is just one of them. A second one is just a simple lack of production. A guy that just never lived up to the expectations that you had of him coming out of college. And this is pretty subjective as well, but there are guys who in college, we assume they would transition. Tough for quarterbacks. That's one of the things. But when we had these high expectations based on what you did in college and you simply don't produce, the word bust is the term that's often used, but it's subjective, but that's a second one. Third one is the player wasn't a good fit. Simply wasn't a good fit. So, and that might not be on the player. That could be on the GM. That could be on the coaching staff, right? If you select a guy that doesn't fit the team's needs, it's about value. That's what this one's about. So there's constant discussions about, do you select for need, or do you reach for a need versus selecting the best player available? And I'm just going to say BPA going forward for best player available. Do you take BPA or need? That's a constant conversation every year around the draft. If your team has a massive hole at a certain position, do you go get the best player at that position, even if there are, in theory, better players? BPA is a different position. What if BPA is not something you need, right? And so there have been times in history where GMs have selected players that didn't really fit the need. And it was a bad choice for that reason. So my personal take is that's about fit, scheme fit, culture fit, understanding who you are as a team and what you need, as well as the type of players you want in your locker room. So the third one is good fit, right? Just stick to who you are and who you want to be as a team. The best example is there's a YouTube video out there about how much people hated on the Jahmyr Gibbs pick at 12. There were people just blasting the Lions for that pick back in 23. It's easy to find. If you type in Detroit Lions draft or Jahmyr Gibbs pick, there are people who have these hard and fast rules. You don't take a running back high. Why would they move up? There are guys who said they had Jahmyr Gibbs in the second round, things like that. So the third one is not a good fit. You maybe draft a player doesn't fit. The fourth one I'm going to call unforeseen circumstances. You draft a player, and at the time you draft him, it makes sense for your team, needs, whatever, and then you make a coaching change, or you make a scheme change, or he gets injured, or there's some off-the-field stuff that there's no way at the time you made the selection you could foresee that. I don't put that as anybody's fault, although some of these are somebody's fault, right? This is simply about at the time of the selection, you didn't know what you didn't know, and the pick might have made sense, but something changed organizationally, something changed off the field, right? I also include injuries in this category because you can't forecast an injury that severely changes the trajectory of a player. You can't. That guy, like a non-football example, the best one is I was just talking today to somebody about Grant Hill of the Pistons, right? My feeling, and you can tell me I'm way off if you're a basketball fan or Grant Hill fan. I think Grant Hill was on track to be one of the greatest players in the history of the league, one of the top 5 players. He was that good. You go back and watch some Grant Hill stats. He was the total package. Now, what he was going to leave the Pistons anyway, but that's not the point. He was on track to be one of the greatest players in the league, and then he had a foot injury, and it was bad. And then my understanding is it was treated incorrectly the first time, and so it got worse. Staph infection, a whole bunch. And he was never the dude he was before the injury. He still came back to be a really good player, had a really good career, but that foot injury changed everything. I truly believe Grant Hill was on track to be one of the greatest players in the history of that league. So, but you can't predict that, right? So, and the fifth one, which is where ultimately I landed on my choice for worst pick, is who could you have chosen instead of the player you actually picked, right? This one has a lot of components, right? Maybe you made a need-based pick instead of picking BPA. Like, the best example of this, maybe your scouting failed, but the best example is Tom Brady. Like, every team in the league, I mean, and I don't know where you feel about him. If you do an objective rating of all-time quarterbacks, he should be one. He could, in theory, be 2 or 3, I guess, if you have some unnatural love for Joe Montana or John Elway or somebody. But every team in the league chose not to pick Tom Brady 5 times, at least 5 times, some of them more. But that's the best example. They were picking for need. Coming out of college, they did not have the scouting report that said Tom Brady might be the greatest quarterback in the history of the league. Nobody knew that, right? And I never considered the Patriots to be brilliant for taking Brady. They got lucky. I think in a moment of honesty, they would even say they got lucky. They get credit for creating an environment in the organization to help Brady reach his full potential, but that was straight luck. So with that said, let's reminder, what are the categories? The categories are, because there are guys that'll fit into multiple categories. That's the thing you got to remember is I might mention a guy in a category and you might say, well, he's that too. And he is, right? So it's where did they get drafted? Simple lack of production, weren't a good fit, unforeseen circumstances, and who could you have drafted instead of them? So it's like 5 categories. So in each category, I'm going to give you a player in Lions history and what they could have done. And then I'll land with my actual selection. And like honorable mention, which I always like the idea of honorable mention. You make a list and then you list people who could have made the list. Joey Harrington, if you're not of a certain age, he was the 3rd overall pick in 2002. And he could fit into a couple. Failed to live up to expectations is the obvious one. He finished his tenure in Detroit like 18-37 with 85 interceptions. And I almost thought that number was wrong. I had to look it up and validate it again. He would fit into not reaching full potential. He would fit into where you were drafted. He was the 3rd overall pick. He had a prolific college career and he's a quarterback, right? There's a lot there. He could also fit in unforeseen circumstances because there were organizational changes where I don't know that the organization did Joey Harrington any favors, and I'll leave it at that. But the biggest case is probably lack of productivity. So Joey Harrington is a guy who gets honorable mention and certainly could have made the list in multiple categories. But here's my list in order of the categories I laid out, where they were drafted. So for where they were drafted, I'm going to go with 1 year after Harrington with the 2nd pick in 2003. The Lions drafted a receiver out of Michigan State named Charles Rogers, hometown guy from Saginaw. I bleed green and white, so I was obviously rooting for the kid. He went to Michigan State. I'm not calling him a kid. He's probably close to my age. He's not much younger. He probably fits in multiple categories. Again, he battled a broken collarbone, which might be the same thing. I think he broke the same one twice, or maybe he broke them both, like early within his first 2 years. Then I think he got suspended for something that I don't think you get suspended for anymore, and it's legal in most states. And then there was some stuff off the field. But I think those other things were connected to the fact that he wasn't playing. Had he not gotten hurt and kept playing, because when he played very well. He was a productive receiver. In the short time, I think he played less than a full season. Over 2 years, he might have played 14, 15 games. And he was good. I thought he was on track. This one, I lean heavily toward the injury, but he was the 2nd player chosen. And I didn't even want to read the list of guys that could have been taken instead, because he probably could fit in that category. So this one is like everything. Where he was drafted second overall, definitely injuries and off the field stuff. He was kind of productive though, and there were guys after him that could have been selected. So Charles Rogers is my choice. Although, like I said, Joey got honorable mention. Where he was drafted, that one hurt. That one hurt. So the second one, simple lack of production. There were a lot of choices here, by the way. Again, I got to keep the voice right. That's why I'm going to have to drink during the podcast. Sorry. The second one, a bust, just what I would call a real bust, is just a few years ago, 2020, third overall pick, could go in that category. Jeff Okudah is a corner out of Ohio State, who I had high hopes for. I like Jeff Okudah. I thought Jeff Okudah was going to, I think I named my fantasy football team that year Okudah Matata. Still love the name. I regret the decision, but it was funny. His career, he could go into the injury thing. He tore his core muscle, and I think he had surgery for that, and he ruptured his Achilles. So he only played like 10 games his first 2 seasons total, right? But he showed some flashes in that third year, but the Lions ultimately traded him, right? He could fit into the injury category, the where you were selected category, the lack of production category. And then if you look at who got drafted after him, Isaiah Simmons was in that draft. Mekhi Becton was in that. Tristan Wirfs, 2 really good offensive linemen. And then way down at 22, some guy named Justin Jefferson got drafted. So you can certainly put him in the who got drafted after you category. But for lack of productivity, and there were other choices, but I went with Jeff Okudah. It was such a high pick, and we needed a corner, and we thought he was the guy, and it did not work out. So Jeff Okudah wasn't a need, and I put this on the GM, and maybe one day I could do worst GM in Lions history, but it would be a runaway. There's no point in doing that one. We all know who wins that award. By all accounts, a nice man, good father, good broadcaster, but he did not do a good job as Lions GM. But in 2005, with the 10th overall pick, and that doesn't seem high, the Lions selected another, air quotes, another receiver. His name was Mike Williams. So the point here is that they had drafted receivers in the 2 previous rounds. Charles Rogers was one, and I think Roy Williams might have been the 04 pick. And if I'm wrong, somebody will correct me. But I think it was Rogers in 03, Roy Williams in 04, Mike Williams in 05. You cannot top 10 pick, draft 3 players in the same. He only caught 37 passes in his 2 years, right? And it was a bad pick for a lot of reasons. But that one's on the GM. I found a couple that didn't make sense. This one that's on the GM, in my opinion, my ultimate choice also could fall in this category. But 2005, 10th overall pick, Mike Williams wasn't a good fit. GM messed up. Unforeseen circumstances. I think this guy got a bad rap, and I always liked him. Andre Ware is a quarterback out of Houston in 1990. I went back a little bit, but I think we know who he was, right? 7th overall pick. And at the time, the Lions were running a certain style of offense. It was very similar to what he ran in Houston. It was this wide open offensive scheme that probably was never truly sustainable. But after selecting him, I think they made a bunch of changes. And fundamentally, what he did well in college, they just stopped doing it. They made an organizational change, and they stopped doing what he was great at. And they wasted that pick. That guy may or may not have been really good. I thought he was good. He had the potential to be very good. But when it's like drafting a guy that can throw fastballs and then sticking them in the outfield, or some other weird analogy, or drafting Shaq to shoot your free throws. I like Shaq. I shouldn't have said that. It didn't make sense to draft him and then not play the scheme that he fit, that he flourished in, that he thrived in. So that was a weird one that I mostly put on the team. I don't know ultimately what the quarterback could have been, what he could have accomplished. We'll never know, because shortly after drafting him, they made a change. So the last category was who you could have chosen instead. And this is where we get to my ultimate choice, the award. And I'm not suggesting the 2014 draft was easy. If I went back, analyzed it, I see a lot of things. Multiple teams missed on multiple players, and that happens in every draft. But in the 2014 draft, as I went back and looked at it, and I looked at the roster, there is no case that can be made. No, there is no case that can be made that the most pressing need the Lions had was at tight end. There was not. So this one fits in a lot, right? Not as much where. They had the 10th overall pick, right? So you do that analysis like I've talked about for the last 20 minutes. Who's there? Where are you picking? What are your needs? But there was no case I could make that they should have selected a tight end at 10. And I need to make this part very clear, because I'm literally saying he was the worst pick in the history. This is not about Eric Ebron, right? Eric Ebron played 8 years in the league, a lot more than most, was very productive, briefly with the Lions and more so with other teams after he left the Lions. He even went to the Pro Bowl in 2018. So this is not about Eric Ebron. I don't even know how to put this one on the player or the GM. There are people who didn't like Eric Ebron, maybe attitude-wise. I didn't really care about that. And it's not about his skill as a player. I can't make that any clearer. I think Eric Ebron had an 8-year NFL career. You can stop right there and say a lot of dudes don't get that. Productive, Pro Bowl, whatever. It's not about Eric. It's about who they could have selected. And you can talk about Odell Beckham Jr. if you want. Probably could have used him. You could talk about a corner named Kyle Fuller, who probably would have helped the team. You can talk about a multi-time Pro Bowl guard named Zach Martin, and you would have a good case. You could just say those names and probably make a good case. But if you're a Lions fan and you're a draft fan, you know where I'm going, right? The most obvious is Aaron Donald, right? Possibly the greatest defensive tackle in the history of football. Full stop. We could have had Aaron Donald. And this conversation's been had before. This is not new. I didn't just create this, right? He is potentially the greatest defensive tackle in the history of pro football. And he went a few picks after Ebron. So it's not just the Lions who did this. There are other teams, other people who do podcasts about their teams in other places that could do the same podcast. And they probably would go back to the 2014 draft, and whoever their team chose would say that. And again, it's not about Eric Ebron, because I named a bunch of guys earlier that weren't nearly the players that Eric Ebron was. So it's not about the guy. This category is who you could have taken instead. And I think that's where I land on that is Okudah hurt. I didn't love the Okudah pick. Back then, Joey Harrington hurt. He was a quarterback. He was supposed to be our future. Charles Rogers, just for a whole bunch of weird reasons, that hurt as well. But for me, it becomes about we could have had Aaron Donald. We could have had Aaron Donald. And that's where you land. It's not even an Ebron conversation. But I think that so that's my list. Feel free to throw something in the comments or in there. And I saw a few that popped up on the side, but I didn't get to them. So I'm gonna drop a bunch of these. I think the next one I'm gonna do is I think I'm gonna do second best player. So look for that one. I don't know if I'll do it live. There's some travel coming up. Maybe I drop it and I record it and drop it later for you guys just to check out. Just getting back into the flow, getting back ready for the real season coming up in a couple of weeks. But feel free to throw some ideas my way. If you have some thoughts, let me know. I hope you guys enjoyed the show today, the short show, as we're calling it, the short drops. Before we know it, we're going to be back talking real games. So we'll drop these in every now and then just for fun. I know I said it last year because I say it every year, but I like the state of the organization. I like the 2026 team. I like what they did in the draft. And I think that it is not out of line. If you're a schedule guy, you think they have a weak schedule. I think the schedule doesn't matter every year because every team's different. But I do like the schedule. And as I look at it, I like what 2026 is shaping up to be for the Detroit Lions. So that's a quick one. Worst all-time pick. No disrespect to him. 2014. It is what it is. We could have had Aaron Donald. So if you like the show, let me know. If you have some comments, you think I missed somebody or there was a better choice, throw it in. I'll revisit it. But look for something later in the week. I might do second greatest player of all time. And I'll be interested if somebody thinks that there is another player that could be in the running. But as for today, worst draft pick of all time, I feel pretty comfortable with my choice. But I'm interested if you guys have any other thoughts on who it could be, who it might be, who deserves to be mentioned. I think I hit the high ones. I stayed 90s and up. So I think I hit the high notes. But like I said, look for second greatest player of all time. If you got any ideas about topics you think I should hit, please feel free and let me know. Look for a few more of these short ones coming up. Other than that, have a good day and we'll talk to you soon. All right.